Hi, welcome to the channel. So today I'm reacting to a video all about Australia and World War II from the channel History Blitz. Please go check out their channel. I will link it down below. They seem to have a lot of great content. This is Australians did this one thing before any other nation in World War II twice. And before I sat down, I did do a few hours of research just to get a better understanding of Australia and World War II. Let's get to it.
When we think of World War II, Australia may not be the first nation that comes to mind. In fact, it may not even be the second. But what if I told you that this small, far-off country punched well above its weight, not just once, but several times, throughout the war? From holding off Rommel and the all-conquering German army advance in North Africa, to delivering the Allies' first major land victory over Japan in the Pacific War, Australia's contributions were anything but minor. Australia was involved in some of the most pivotal moments of the war, fighting right up to the final day Japan surrendered. Was Australia even needed in World War II? You bet it was. Army, Navy, Air Force at home and abroad. Australia wasn't just supporting, they were part of the main act. When World War II began in 1939, Australia, as part of the British Empire, quickly joined the fight. They sent their soldiers far from home to help Britain in Europe and North Africa. Thousands of young Australians volunteered, eager to defend the empire, fighting in distant lands they had never seen. They battled in the deserts of North Africa and stood against the German forces in Greece, playing a part in Britain's war. But everything changed in December 1941. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, declaring war on the Allies. Suddenly, the war wasn't just in Europe anymore. It was in the Pacific, much closer to Australia. The fall of Singapore, a key British base, left Australia exposed, with the threat of invasion feeling more real than ever. In that moment, the focus of the war shifted. Faced with danger at home, Australia made a tough choice. Prime Minister John Curtin pulled the Australian troops back from Europe and North Africa. It was no longer about supporting Britain. Australia now had to defend itself. The fight for their own land had begun. With Japan pushing through Southeast Asia, Australia was no longer on the sidelines. Now, the Australian people were on the front line of the Pacific War. Australia's geographical position transformed it into a vital base for Allied operations. Its ports and airstrips became the lifelines for campaigns in New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and beyond.
Just to put into context, Papua New Guinea is Australia's closest neighbor. On the northern tip of Queensland, you have a couple of smaller islands, and from Papua New Guinea, it is only a couple of miles, so it's actually very close. But Japan wanted to take control of Papua New Guinea so we could isolate Australia and to launch attacks onto the mainland.
The country's proximity to the battlegrounds meant that its own shores were under imminent threat, adding a profound urgency to its defense efforts. Now, it was clear. Every pair of hands, every plane, every ship was needed to hold the line. Australia wasn't just helping the Allies anymore. They were defending their own soil. But before the war comes to Australian shores, let's go back to the North African campaign and where Australians did something no other country could do: repel a German blitzkrieg attack. April 10th, 1941.
For those of you who don't know, blitzkrieg actually translates to lightning war. It was a German tactic which involved surprising the enemy with tanks, infantry, and planes with the goal of quickly defeating them.
In the empty deserts of Libya, the important port city of Tobruk becomes the center of a fierce battle. General Erwin Rommel, known as the famous feared Desert Fox, has his sights set on this crucial city. Controlling Tobruk would open the door to Egypt and the Suez Canal.
The Suez Canal was of utmost importance to the supply lines, military operations, as well as access to Middle Eastern oil, which was vital for the Allied advance. So the Suez Canal was important for both the Allied and Axis powers.
Which is vital for the British Empire. Standing in his way, the 9th Australian Division, led by the determined Major General Leslie Moreshead. Along with British and Polish soldiers, these men, many of whom were only half-trained and poorly equipped, were given an almost impossible task.
So the defenders were Polish, Australian, British, and Indian, all under the command of Major General Leslie Moreshead, a Gallipoli veteran who had actually earned the title of Ming the Merciless, which was named after the villain in the comic Flash Gordon. But his defensive offense and his taking the fight to the enemy is what really made the difference in this battle.
Defend Tobruk, no matter what. The assault on Tobruk commenced with the now all-too-familiar German blitzkrieg attack. Concentrated air strikes on defensive positions, followed by a ground assault of panzer tanks penetrating weak spots in the defensive perimeter, driving deep behind enemy strongpoints. This then followed by a column of armored vehicles and infantry to attack the enemy units and take advantage of the chaos. However, the Australians were well prepared, and the only chaos was within the German lines. Hiding underground in caves, the Australians weathered the airstrikes without issue. As the panzer columns rolled in, they allowed them to pass their perimeter without engaging them, the Germans believing their plan was unfolding as normal. As the infantry followed behind, however, the Australians sprang their trap. Surfacing from their caves, they engaged the infantry with everything they had. The panzer units, now isolated without their infantry support, found themselves engaged on three sides by Australian artillery, tanks, and air bombardment. The Australians' defense in depth, catching Rommel and his men completely by surprise. Further attempts by Rommel followed over the first few nights of the assault, all without success, all attacks being repelled by the Australian defenders. Rommel's tactics changed to one of a siege. As Rommel's Afrika Korps surrounded Tobruk, cutting off supplies and attacking the city with constant artillery and air raids, the Australians held firm.
It wasn't just Rommel and the Germans that were doing this attack, it was also the Italians. The Italians had previously occupied Tobruk, and they had built an amazing set of fortifications. So when Australia took over, all we had to do was to reinforce all those fortifications.
They lived in dugouts and caves, surviving the scorching desert heat during the day and the freezing cold at night. The Germans mocked them, calling them the Rats of Tobruk, a name the Australians proudly adopted. It represented the strength, cleverness, and determination of Australian soldiers. Tobruk's defenders held off Rommel's best troops for 242 tough days, becoming a symbol of Allied endurance, while Rommel's unbeatable reputation fell apart in the desert heat. The Australians eventually being recalled back to Australia to defend against the imminent danger of the advancing Japanese.
So this was not the first Allied land victory of the war. Greece had actually beat the Italians when they invaded a few months prior to this battle. But it was the first Allied land victory against Germany, which was very significant. And another piece of trivia you might not know is that Australia awarded its first Victoria Cross of the war to a Corporal John Hurst Edmondson for his actions of saving his commander's life on the 13th of April. Unfortunately, he did die of his wounds.
May 1942, another crucial battle emerged that once again tested Australia's resolve. This battle in the Pacific reshaped the direction of World War II. Japan, with its rapid growth unchecked, aimed to capture Port Moresby in New Guinea. Their goal was to strengthen their defensive line and threaten Australia, hoping to cut off communication between Australia and its American allies. Port Moresby was vital for both sides. For Japan, it offered a base to launch attacks on Australia, and for the Allies, it was necessary for keeping supply routes open and staging attacks against Japan.
To put things into perspective, the town of Bamaga in the northern tip of Queensland was only about 300 miles from Port Moresby. And the Japanese long-range bombers, the Bettys, actually had a range of about 2,000 miles.
The Japanese plan involved the Port Moresby Invasion Group, which included the small aircraft carrier Shoho, along with cruisers and support ships, led by Admiral Takagi. Two larger carriers, Zuikaku and Shokaku, were also part of the carrier striking force. The Allies, using decoded Japanese messages, were able to anticipate the attack and prepared a counter-strike. Allied forces included Task Force 44, led by Rear Admiral Crace, with the Australian heavy cruiser HMAS Australia and the light cruiser HMAS Hobart, and Task Force 17, led by Rear Admiral Fletcher, which had the U.S. carriers USS Lexington and USS Yorktown. The battle began with great force on May 4, 1942, when the Allies made the first move. In a brave attack, they succeeded in sinking the Japanese carrier Shoho, scoring an important win that briefly slowed Japan's progress. But the danger wasn't gone yet. The larger and stronger carriers Zuikaku and Shokaku were still out there, ready to strike. As the days went on, the fighting became even more intense. On May 7th, in the confusion of battle, U.S. forces accidentally hit a group of Japanese oilers, a costly mistake. Then, on May 8th, the skies over the Pacific turned into a deadly battlefield as planes from both sides clashed. Explosions filled the air as bombs and bullets flew.
Were the Japanese using kamikaze attacks at this time yet?
By the end of the day, the powerful USS Lexington had sunk, and the damaged Shokaku was forced to pull back. After 4 days of heavy fighting, both sides pulled back. Though both suffered heavy losses, the Japanese had to give up their plan to invade Port Moresby by sea. For the first time in the Pacific, Japan's advance was stopped. This battle meant a lot to Australia. The danger would have been real and close if Japan had captured Port Moresby. At that moment, the country's safety was on the line, and Australia stood strong. But Japan wasn't giving up on their plan to capture the port. They have decided to try a different approach. In mid-1942, Japan sought to capture Port Moresby through a second route, overland, via the Kokoda track. A treacherous 96-kilometer trail through the dense jungles of the Australian-controlled territory of Papua. The Kokoda track was vital for the defense of Australia, as controlling it would enable the Japanese to launch further attacks on Port Moresby and Australia itself. The 39th Australian Battalion was tasked with defending the track. Later, they were reinforced by the 7th Division and other units, bringing the total number of Australian troops to about 8,000.
The Choco soldiers, or the chocolate soldiers, they were made up, I think, of reservists and conscripted soldiers. They actually played a huge part in this battle. I think they got their name because they were given a piece of chocolate in their rucksack or their rat sack, and they were expected to melt under pressure because they had almost no experience and very little training.
They faced the Japanese 17th Army, with roughly 8,000 troops determined to capture Port Moresby. In July 1942, the Japanese started their attack on the Kokoda track, moving quickly through the dense jungle. By August and September, the Australians, using guerrilla tactics to fight back, managed to hold them off at Brigade Hill and Isurava. They were outnumbered, but they fought hard. In October, with more soldiers joining them, the Australians began to push the Japanese back, step by step. By November, after months of tough battles, the Japanese were retreating.
Let's not forget that the Aussies were helped by the Papuan Infantry Brigade, as well as the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels, which were some of the local population, worked as porters, did supply runs, and helped evacuate the wounded.
They had failed again to reach their goal of capturing Port Moresby. But whilst the Australians at Kokoda had fiercely defended the track, the Japanese withdrawal was ultimately due to another battle taking place on the island, the Battle of Milne Bay. Being a strategic harbour on the southeastern tip of Papua, the Japanese aimed to capture the airstrips at Milne Bay to support their Kokoda offensive and launch further attacks on Port Moresby. In late August 1942, the Japanese launched an amphibious assault with around 2,000 special naval landing troops. However, they had severely underestimated the strength of the Allied defenses.
So I don't think those Marines were the same as the jungle warfare specialists, because in July, Japan actually deployed 1,500 of its jungle warfare specialists, who at the time were considered to be almost invincible.
Over 9,000 Allied troops, primarily Australian forces, under Major General Cyril Clowes, were stationed at Milne Bay, supported by 2 RAAF squadrons of P-40 Kitty Hawks, American engineers, and anti-aircraft units. On August 25, 1942, the Japanese landed 11 kilometers away from where they had planned and quickly started moving toward the airstrips. Over the next couple of days, August 27th and 28th, they had some early success, managing to make their way to number 3 airstrip. However, the airstrip was a perfect defensive position for the Australians, with the bay at one end and the dense jungle at the other. Clowes set up his defenses well with the Australian 61st and 25th Battalions, along with the American engineers. 3 times the Japanese tried to cross the airstrip. 3 times the Australians repelled the attackers. As the Japanese withdrew, the Australians went on the counterattack. 5 days of fierce jungle warfare ensued, with the Australians successfully coordinating air and artillery attacks, pushing the Japanese back and inevitably forcing their withdrawal off the island. This was the first time Japanese land forces had been beaten, and the first time the Japanese advance had been stopped in World War II.
And also proved that Japan's jungle warfare specialists could be defeated.
The Australians enhancing their reputation as capable and reliable fighters. With Japan's rapid advances in Southeast Asia and the fall of Singapore in 1942, Australia found itself directly in the path of invasion.
Did Japan actually have plans to invade Australia? And the answer is yes and no. In 1941, Japan did have plans to actually invade Australia sometime in 1942. However, that plan was quickly scrapped.
On February 19th, 1942, the war finally arrived on Australian soil. At 10 a.m., 188 Japanese aircraft launched a devastating attack on Darwin, bombing its harbour, airfields, and military installations. This marked the largest foreign assault ever on Australian land.
Is Darwin in Queensland, or where is Darwin exactly?
8 ships were sunk, over 20 aircraft were destroyed, and at least 235 people lost their lives. A second wave of 54 bombers followed in the afternoon, causing even more damage to Darwin's infrastructure. This attack was just the beginning. Over the next 21 months, Darwin was bombed 64 times, as Japan aimed to disrupt the vital supply lines and military operations that made the city a key Allied base in the Pacific. Defending Darwin was crucial to the broader war effort, as its strategic position supported the Allied counteroffensive in Southeast Asia. The threat soon spread to Australia's eastern shores. On May 31st, 1942, 3 Japanese midget submarines infiltrated Sydney Harbour. While one submarine was caught in defence nets and another destroyed before it could strike, the second managed to fire torpedoes. Although the USS Chicago was missed, HMAS Kokoda, a barrack ship, was hit and sunk, killing 21 sailors. Just a week later, Japanese submarines shelled both Sydney and Newcastle, causing minor damage, but leaving Australians anxious about further attacks. These assaults shocked the nation. Once feeling secure in its isolation, Australia now faced the harsh reality of war on its own soil. The attacks on Darwin, Sydney, and Newcastle united the country in a fierce resolve to defend itself and its allies. The home front became just as crucial as the battlefields abroad, as Australians prepared to stand firm against the looming threat. Australia's role in World War II was extremely important. Its key location, along with the brave efforts of its military, played a big part in the defeat of the Axis powers. Australians continued to play an important role as a member of the Allies' forces, pushing back of the Japanese in the Pacific and fighting in Borneo right up to the 15th of August when Japanese surrendered.
Quick shout out to Melbourne and Australia for its help. After the Battle of Guadalcanal, the Marine 1st Infantry Division actually spent about 8 or 9 months in Melbourne, resting, refitting, and training.
Fittingly, it was the 9th Australian Division, the Rats of Tobruk, that were the main force in Borneo when the fighting ended. By staying strong despite tough challenges, Australia helped secure important areas.
So was General Moreshead still the commander of the Rats at that time? Because after Tobruk, he did go on to win battles such as the Second Battle of El Alamein. So he had a lot on his resume.
Defend crucial supply routes and stop the progress of powerful enemies. Its dedication to the Allied cause helped shape the world after the war and to bring peace to the Pacific region. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories of courage and resilience. Together, we honor those who fought for our freedom.
My utmost respect to Australia. I thought this was a great video, which gave us an introduction of the Diggers' contribution to the war. I'll definitely react to some more in-depth videos about those battles, especially the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels, which I'm surprised he did not mention. But great video. If you want to help the channel out, I'd appreciate a like, sub, share, comment, or thanks.